And basically how we respond to that can impact on mental health right across the lifespan.
So the die isn't necessarily cast, but it seems like the odds are stacked quite heavily against you in terms of these outcomes, whether it's psychopathology.
So, I mean, like if 8% of students are saying to me that they've attempted suicide prior to starting college, so something needs to be done at an earlier age.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the Mental Wellbeing College. Today we are joined by Dr. Margaret McLafferty to discuss all things childhood adversity and college student mental health. Margaret is a research fellow at Ulster University and the Atlantic Technological University, and she has researched prolifically in both of these subject areas, including conducting global studies looking at prevalence rates of mental illness in students. In today's episode, we discuss when stress becomes toxic, some of the psychological impacts of early life stress on adolescent and adult development, why not all students who have mental health issues reach out for help, and which groups of college students are at the most risk of mental health issues, and much, much more. If today's episode or any of the other episodes of the Mental Wellbeing College brings you value, I would be super grateful if you were to hit subscribe or follow, or to share this episode with a loved one. This is how we continue to grow the show and helps our mission of impacting people the world over with a free, accessible resource on evidence-based wellbeing strategies that people can readily take and implement in their life. Thanks so much for tuning in, and now to today's episode on childhood adversity and college student mental health with Dr. Margaret McLafferty. Welcome to the Mental Wellbeing College, where we take a deep dive into the wonderful world of mental wellbeing. Each episode, we take a journey through the evidence with a global subject expert to extract the applicable strategies so you can take steps to improving your mental wellbeing. When does stress become toxic?
There's a lot of controversy over stress. People often think, stress is always toxic. That's not necessarily the case. There's 3 types of stress responses. There can be a positive response, a tolerable response, and a toxic stress response. So first of all, a positive response to stress occurs when the stressor is mild and the person responds normally to it with absolutely no negative consequences. And actually that type of stress can be beneficial in that it can help a person, to learn actually to deal with stress. Then a tolerable stress response, that occurs, I suppose, when the stressor is more severe. However, the stressor could be time limited, that it's only over a short period of time. And there may be, something protective, a caregiver that's there to help the person adapt and cope with that stressor. However, toxic stress occurs when the stressor is severe or chronic and goes on for a long period of time, and there might be no protective relationship to help buffer that negative impact of stress. For example, childhood trauma that might go on for a long period of time, and that can be particularly detrimental if that trauma is maybe associated with a caregiver. So high levels of stress can be really, really detrimental, and basically how we respond to that can impact on mental health right across the lifespan. I mean, I've done numerous studies where I've looked at that and how childhood or early trauma can lead to really severe problems with depression, anxiety, suicidal behaviour for many, many years. So when you're looking at that healthy stress response, it can be shaped by early attachment. So if that isn't there in the family setting, and again, it can be developed, the healthy stress response can be developed through supportive relationships with the primary caregivers.
And you think you mentioned an important point there about coping strategies, and it feels like as a youngster, as a young child, a lot of your coping comes from a parent scaffolding and supporting you. And when you don't have that, that stress can become a lot more negative and detrimental.
No, definitely, definitely. And I mean, it's about coping strategies and about, even self-regulation. So a toxic stress response can lead to actually chemical imbalances in the brain, and how these imbalances are addressed can subsequently impact on mental health and well-being. Whereas if a child learns like good adaptive self-regulation strategies, such as being able to, deal with these consequences, it can be really, really good. So adaptive regulation strategies such as exercise, relaxation, meditation, that can actually lead to chemical imbalances being addressed naturally with little or no consequences. But maladaptive self-regulation strategies, like such as self-harm, drugs, alcohol consumption, which many people turn to if they have experienced trauma, they can have a very detrimental impact.
So you mentioned this kind of trauma, and the term childhood adversity or adverse childhood experiences comes up a lot in the literature. Can you give us an insight into what some of these traumas are that can be so detrimental to a child's development, but also have mental health consequences a long time down the lifespan?
When you're looking at childhood trauma, a lot of people refer to adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Now, the traditional measure of ACEs focused on 10 childhood traumas: child physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, emotional neglect, physical neglect, person in the home being mentally ill or having suicidal behaviour, or substance abuse within the family, or maybe that the child has witnessed domestic violence, parental loss, or criminality. Now, when I was studying childhood trauma, I tend to call it childhood adversities, in that my research would be a bit broader. So my research was part of the World Mental Health Survey Initiative, which is led by Ron Kessler and numerous colleagues in Harvard and right across the globe. And that was an epidemiological study. So we've been able to make cross-country comparisons. So they looked at childhood trauma similar to the ones that I mentioned, but they also looked at economic adversity, which tends to, people don't necessarily consider that, but like if you've experienced severe economic adversity within in childhood, it can have really long-lasting repercussions as well, and it can feed into a lot of these other traumas. I mean, generally, childhood adversities rarely occur in isolation. It's unlikely, that a child just experiences one trauma. A lot of them will come hand in hand, unfortunately. If a parent is mentally ill, the child may experience, neglect, or it's just kind of can come hand in hand. I'm not saying that happens for everybody, but quite often there is like a series of different adversities experienced at the same time. Like I have looked at individual traumas and how each of them impacted on, say, different mental health problems. So, for example, I think in some of my earlier studies, we found that domestic violence, for example, was there was a significant association with substance abuse later in life. A lot of studies will find that childhood sexual abuse has really long-lasting implications in terms of mood, anxiety disorders, etc., suicidal behaviour in particular, because they are carried out by an attachment figure, and they're often conducted over a long period of time. For example, a lot of epidemiological studies, would suggest that they contribute really, really heavily, to mental well-being. I know my colleague Ron Kessler conducted a great study that I cited loads of times, and I was back in 2010. but they found that childhood adversities accounted for nearly a quarter of all mood disorders and about a third of anxiety disorders and substance abuse globally.
When you say accounted for, what does that mean? Can you clarify that for listeners?
So, in the absence, they would say, like, if these childhood traumas, didn't occur, there could be less, of these disorders. One of my studies, I looked at population attributional factors. I'm not going to get into that too much, but like it looked at, if you eradicated a certain type of adversity, like say economic adversity, there could be like 10% less, mood disorders in the world.
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
There's lots of different risk factors found globally. Like within the Northern Ireland setting, for example, like we found that parental mental illness played like a really significant role in like any of the disorders that we looked about. Like sexual abuse was associated with mood and anxiety disorder, and family violence and parental divorce, substance abuse, for example. Whereas other countries, there was like slight differences found. So if you're looking at childhood trauma and looking at the impact that it might have on mental health and well-being, it can like really, you can find like stark differences.
It's a really important point as well that you bring up about a lot of these ACEs kind of propagating multiply in the same kind of family, where if there's economic adversity, then there's generally an increased likelihood of things like abuse, substance use. And it seems like when you have this, I know this term is poly-victimization, or when you have these multiple kind of ACEs and a child is a victim of multiple different adversities, abuses, that is a really, like percentile wise, a much stronger predictor of later mental illnesses, depression, PTSD.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that's so. As I mentioned that early in my studies, like I looked at the individual ACEs, but I have a number of papers where I conducted an analysis. It's called latent class analysis or latent profile analysis, where I looked at, we kind of categorize people into subgroups. So generally, we would find, now there's a few different analysis run, but you would find like maybe the majority of people might be in like a low risk class. Then you might have people who experienced, I was terming parental maladjustment adversities, which is where the parent, has a number of issues themselves. And then what we would classify maybe as a high risk class, which there's a lot of maltreatment. And again, as I said, like the real, like the maltreatment adversities seem to be the ones that are, the most detrimental. And whatever studies, any of the studies that I'm doing, like if you compare the people who are in the category for like high risk in comparison to low risk groups, then like they can be between 3 to 5 times more likely to have specific disorders, be it mood, anxiety, and substance abuse, and PTSD, as you say. I have a paper where I've looked at PTSD, and again, like lots of issues there, and a very strong association with experiencing childhood trauma.
So the die isn't necessarily cast, but it seems like the odds are stacked quite heavily against you in terms of these outcomes, whether it's psychopathology, memory impairment, less functioning as you grow to be an adult if you have a lot of these ACEs in your childhood or childhood adversity.
Yeah, they can be. I mean, unfortunately, it can be, it can nearly become a cycle. You'll also find, the offspring of people who have experienced childhood trauma, they may actually be at a greater risk of being exposed themselves to adverse childhood experiences due to what their parents have experienced and the resultant, detrimental impact on their parents' mental health and well-being. And this can lead to unsuitable, inadequate parenting being transmitted across generations. So it's like really, really important, to try and break that cycle some way. Now, that's not to say that everybody who experiences childhood trauma, goes on to have a mental illness. Like, of course, that's not the case. And that, thankfully, that cycle can be broken with, under the correct circumstances. Early intervention, prevention strategies, etc., can be really, really beneficial. And, like I've talked about caregivers, I mean, like all you really need is just, they'll talk about like this one caring adult or one, somebody in your life can really, help shape you. Like it could be a grandparent, it doesn't necessarily have to be your parent. It could be a teacher. Like a lot of people that have, you'll see that on, TV, it's quite often publicized, where, somebody will come up and say, look, yes, I had a really bad childhood, but one teacher stood out and really helped me. It could be a friend. Like, again, the research shows, good social networks or some sort of social support can be so, so beneficial.
Yeah, and I think that's so crucial because one thing that reading through literature about the kind of ameliorating effect or the mitigating effect of parental support on children who go through childhood adversity is it feels like a bit of a paradox because a lot of these children, the perpetrators or the causes for their adversities, the parents themselves, not always, but if they're experiencing abuse or if their parents are incarcerated, these are the contributing factors which lead to these poor outcomes of mental illness and whatnot. So to know that even if that is you, even if your parents are the ones perpetrating, these instances or causing this childhood adversity, that other adults in your life, like you said, a teacher, a grandparent, can help to mitigate some of these really harmful effects.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like I suppose, like that support, like can be just it can just change somebody's life. So social support can like provide, a buffering effect. So it's protecting the person from the harmful effects of stress that we've been talking about. Like social support can be beneficial even in the absence of stress, in that it helps promote the development of attributes such as good self-esteem, self-worth, and good emotion regulation. Like I talk a lot in my work about emotion regulation strategies, and how people, like if you're able to manage your emotions, that can really help you deal with stress. And then like social, like I think the whole buffering effect of it, the only thing I would say is, like, when looking at social support and looking at the building of relationships, unfortunately a lot of children or people who've dealt with childhood trauma, they can find it really, really difficult to form those relationships in the first place. So like there's a double whammy, um, and that can, if you're unable to form meaningful relationships with others, and maybe meaningful relationships with your own children, going into the future, then that can, lead to problems again, as I say, across the generations.
Yeah, in cognitive behavioral therapy, we talk a lot about core beliefs, and I can imagine that a lot of these children would have core beliefs about other people being untrustworthy, they're a danger if they've had abuse, perpetrated on them or childhood adversity at the hands of people who are supposed to be the ones who love them the most. Then what's the point in me trusting other people around me, which can be a barrier towards them forming those healthy relationships?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. I suppose it just all leads into, like your coping strategies, you know, as I mentioned, emotion regulation, like is so important. And like you can learn your emotion regulation from others, which is why it is, so important to have those relationships.
You mentioned, yeah, emotion regulation a couple of times. So can you tell us a little bit about what some of the emotion regulation strategies that you see typically in children who've had to go through this kind of childhood adversity? I think suppression is one that I've seen you talk about a bit.
So suppression would be one, and then just like worrying, like just like rumination, and like just dwelling on your experiences, like like you can see how that would impact on your mental health. So like they would be seen as like the kind of the really maladaptive emotion regulation strategies. Um, But there are like maltreatment during childhood, that's been linked to disruptions in emotion regulation strategies. Like, as I said, greater rumination, impulsive responses, etc., and just overall higher emotion reactivity, can, have a really detrimental impact, particularly, if it's going on. I mean, like, if you think yourself, if you're constantly ruminating about something like a, like you're not sleeping well, it can lead to like your, just depressed mood. You can be anxious, etc. And, so it's just developing strategies that might help you, develop kind of, I suppose, more adaptive emotion regulation strategies, like just, being, I suppose, more accepting and
suppression, rather, for people who don't understand or don't know what that means, kind of bottling things up and pushing them down rather than accepting and deal with those emotions, and which is often linked with substance use as well. When the emotions get too big and you can no longer suppress them, going to drugs, alcohol, self-harm to be able to deal with those big emotions. And you can imagine how that plays out right in a child when they don't have the coping strategies, or in an adolescent when they haven't learned the right coping strategies and don't have the support around them. Then it can probably feel like it's your last resort, these maladaptive coping strategies.
if you're unable to cope and you're not developing those strategies, like, it really can have like long-term impact on your well-being. If you're constantly ruminating about something and not able to deal with stress, it's leading into, I suppose, the whole like stress sensitization, you know, um, so repeated exposure, to stressful events can lead, to heightened stress sensitivity, which can impact on your psychological health. Like, when we talk about stress sensitization, it's like, you just get so sensitized to stress that it's nearly like, you know, that it can just take something quite small that would trigger that emotional response to stress, so it's not necessarily, it wouldn't necessarily be a big event that could really impact on you. So it's just, this constant, as we talked about earlier, this chronic stress, it's going on for a long time. It just can leave the body absolutely exhausted, both physically and mentally.
Yeah, a lower threshold to stress and the effects of stress on your mental health in terms of stress sensitization, and also it seems like when you do experience stress, it's harder to kind of return to baseline, harder to return to homeostasis. But the idea being that if you don't learn that healthy kind of stress system when you're young, when the stress system is more plastic, that you take that with you in adulthood and you respond quicker to smaller things, but also longer, and take longer to come back to baseline. What can we do to help ameliorate some of these effects, to change this, particularly given the cycle? So we talked a little bit about social support. Are there other kind of low-hanging fruit or solutions that you think here could be helpful?
I suppose it depends on, what country you're in or what part of the world that you're in. But, because there are lots of like different, programs out there. So within the like UK and Ireland, like there's like likes of Bernardo's would provide, different programs. I'm just saying that, for example, I think the key to it is like early intervention and prevention strategies are like really, really important to help those most at risk and their families. Um, so it's about supporting families and trying to enhance, parent-child relationships where possible. Um, so, for example, within Northern Ireland, there was like Sure Start programs. So it's going in really, really early, helping, to, with that whole like attachment with the children, like, starting as young as possible. Um, you know, and a lot of it is focusing on family strengths and teaching people basically how to parent and helping, parents to communicate with their children. Within the school setting as well, like there's lots of programs, for the children that maybe have been experiencing trauma, and resilience building programs can be like really, really beneficial. One program that was run in Northern Ireland actually really, really successfully was Schools for Hope. So that was a program that can be delivered to both primary and secondary school students. Now, it's not like just aimed at children with trauma, but it's aims to kind of increase problem solving and reduce that emotion focused coping strategies and help develop better emotion regulation skills. Like they would be just some examples, but I think it's like focusing on the parent as early as possible and focusing then on children through schools within the university setting. I do a lot of work within with university students. That's the area of work that I'm in at the moment. And, like we're seeing like loads of students coming into college with a lot of pre-existing mental health problems, for example. And a lot of them can be traced back to their childhood. And we've been doing like a lot of work with them on different interventions that might help, help them cope within the university setting, for example, as well. So I think it's just important to have it at different levels.
I love what you're saying as well about the family side of things and involving the parent. I was part of this project called Parent-Child Interaction Therapy, where it was delivered a free program run by a particular university here in Sydney to schools in very low socioeconomic areas, so some of the poorest areas of Sydney, to children with really severe, moderate to severe behavioural symptoms, so things like ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder. But the idea being that it's not necessarily just targeting the child, but teaching the parent how to not only regulate themselves, because if you've got having a lot of conflict in the home, it can be difficult for a parent who's never learnt those skills to calm themselves, calm their nervous system down as well, but also to model those skills for the child, because ultimately, in most cases, they're the biggest role model for the child and the biggest influence in the child's life. So if you can teach the parent those skills, it goes a long way towards helping the child themselves.
So important.
What about, have you thought about welfare systems at all, particularly given like a lot of this childhood adversity propagates in families that are low socioeconomic? Have you thought about how that plays a role in terms of helping these parents with some of the problems that might be causing huge psychological distress and then filtering down to the child? Is there any correlation there on a country level, or have you seen this done well in some countries at all?
Well, I haven't, like my research has focused, I have mentioned earlier that I focused on economic adversity and how like there's a very strong correlation between economic adversity and mental health problems across the lifespan. In fact, in Northern Ireland, economic adversity was one of the main adversities as such that impacted on mental health. I think it was second only to like the really like the maltreatment adversities. So I haven't looked at the welfare systems as such. Now, obviously, within Northern Ireland, when we were looking at the childhood traumas, now this was we were surveying adults, so looking at retrospectively at their childhood experiences. Now, what should be said is a lot of these people would actually have grown up during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So, and there was a lot of disadvantage and economic circumstances accompanied with that. So like that's a completely like another subject altogether. But like again, like if you're thinking globally, like there's so many people growing up or have grown up during conflict, and again, like that can have a direct impact on them, but it can also have an impact on the family, and that can again lead to to different childhood traumas again. Like I'm just thinking, of some of the recent conflicts and everything that's going on globally. Like, yeah, unfortunately, there's people think, oh, sure, that's all in the past. You know, Parents now know, what needs to be done for their child. But like, if you're living under conflict circumstances or where there's really high levels of deprivation in your community, it can be so hard, to break out of that cycle, as I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to the stress sensitization, right? In terms of if your stress system is plastic and still developing and you're in a high conflict zone where there's bombs being dropped and people being murdered, it's completely understandable, right, that that person is going to have a pretty sensitive stress response and is very likely to develop that kind of psychopathology given they're just not prepared. I mean, who is prepared to go through that kind of stuff, but especially when you're a child.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, your parents are experiencing the same trauma, trying to protect the child. Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, it's just.
Yeah, it definitely is, especially with what's going on at the moment around the world. But you mentioned something as well, Margaret, about when they're older, kind of different interventions. So if you're someone who's listening and has been through this childhood adversity, you're either a student, you're an adult, what are some things that they can do to help ameliorate some of the mental health effects? Are there specific things for those who've gone through childhood adversity but have depression, or childhood adversity but have an anxiety disorder? Are there specific treatments available, or is it more sort of, the general therapy kind of approach that you take for someone who has clinical depression but, hasn't been through childhood adversity?
I think the first thing that I would say, to somebody, I mean, you're saying about treatments. Quite often, people don't want to, um, you know, look for help. They're reluctant to seek help, mainly because of stigma. Like we would find, like a lot of our students are coming in, or like as I say, it doesn't have to be students. Like, but for example, like we would have the majority of people coming in are saying that they haven't looked for help. They'd be reluctant to look for help, and the first thing I'd be saying to somebody is, if you're struggling, like we've a saying here, it's okay not to be okay. So the first thing is, if you're struggling, don't be afraid to reach out to somebody. Now, that might be a family member that you trust. It could be a friend. The first thing to do is to actively like look for help. Even if you don't want to talk to somebody, like go online, Google, like there's lots and lots of resources online. Um, the first point, if somebody comes to me and said, I'm really struggling, like, the first point that here we would say to somebody is, look, go and talk to your GP. Like the GP can be the gateway into, lots of, the treatment options for you, be it that they then refer you on, to a psychologist, psychiatrist, counselling, whatever. But even in the absence of the GP, there's you can be self-referred, like to some counselling services. Like look at, I'm involved in a voluntary organisation. People can self-refer into that. It's just a phone call. Um, there's loads of different options out there now. There's lots of online CBT, for example, um, different programs, resilience building programs, mindfulness, for example, has been found to be really, really beneficial. Now, I'm not a clinician myself, but like I've talked to so many people, that have struggled and that are struggling So the main thing is to just reach out to somebody, and look for, what option might suit you. Like, we've recently been involved in like an online CBT. It's a guided intervention. It was developed by Pim Kuipers and Helene Ripers in VU Amsterdam. And, like, that was really designed for somebody that did not want to go to a counselling session. It's available 24/7. Now, that was specific for students, but there's lots of similar interventions out there that can really, really help you.
Yeah, this is the beauty of the internet and having so many digital interventions now. If you're not ready to speak to someone, that apps like Headspace, or in Australia we have something called This Way Up, which is again online CBT for anxiety disorders, for depression, which you can take as a way to start if you're not ready and you're not all the way there to go to the more intensive one-on-one therapy. Because you're right, people are at different steps with their mental health, right, in terms of their preparedness to seek help and what that help looks like for them.
Yeah, I think that just the key message is, like, just reach out. Like, stigma was always a big issue. People are afraid, oh, people will look at me differently. But I think a lot of work, has, helped with that. And I think, we have a lot of celebrities coming out saying, yes, I'm depressed. I've had a substance abuse problem. I've got help. I think all of that can be positive. So I think, that would be my main message, is just, to look for help.
Very sound advice for those listening who are in that boat. Now, Margaret, you also have done some wonderful recent research on college student mental health, which is a very interesting and applied area for the Mental Wellbeing College audience, many of whom are students. Let's start by talking about something that you did allude to earlier, which is the link between childhood adversity and college student mental health. And in fact, one of your papers, you found that a significant percentage, I'll let you go through the numbers, but a significant percentage of all mental illnesses in a college student sample, I think it was a global college student sample, about 20,000 students, could have been avoided if they hadn't experienced childhood adversity. So what's the link there? What are some of those numbers? What's that relationship look like?
A lot of people, when they're thinking about student mental health, they think, oh, college is like a really stressful time, and people, can get a lot of mental health problems when they're in college. But we actually found that loads and loads of students, like really, really high rates, were actually starting college with pre-existing mental health problems. Like, I'm talking like 20, like maybe like 20% of students were coming in with anxiety disorders, or mood disorders, and really, really high rates of suicidal behavior. Like, for example, in our studies, we were finding that about 8% of students were saying that they had attempted suicide prior to starting university. Now, given like that, the average age of students, on a lot of our courses were like 18, 19, 20. Now, yes, we have mature students as well, but like, that's like really, really stark figures. So we started to look at, what are the risk factors, and again, what are the protective factors. So some of the risk factors were these childhood adversities. Again, I looked at subgroups, and, people that had experienced high levels of maltreatment and just, childhood trauma. Again, like, they were significant risk factors. Like, they were between 3 and 5 times more likely to have a mental health disorder or to have engaged in suicidal behavior than those who hadn't experienced adversities. And when we started to, dive into this a bit more, so within, like, I did psychology myself, and I would have taught in psychology modules, and just talking to my colleagues, they were saying, like, they were finding like quite a high level of certain mental health problems, particularly around like panic disorders, in among their students. So I actually did a paper where I looked at, like different courses and different mental health problems, and there's higher prevalence of some mental health problems in some courses than others, for example. And when we looked at that, like a lot of people were actually, it was nearly as if they were drawn towards certain courses like psychology and social work as well, if they had experienced childhood trauma. So like, like you can understand that if you've, experienced trauma within your childhood and you've been dealing, maybe like you've had like, social workers involved, like you might get an interest in that. Or again, if you've had mental health issues or your parents had mental health issues, then you could be drawn to psychology because, some would say it's like, nearly, self, treatment, or, you're trying to treat yourself. But like, it's obvious, like I was drawn to psychology because like it's just, you know, it's such a wide area. I have to say, like, thankfully, I didn't have childhood trauma, but I was aware of, others, and like, just different things that, starts making you, get an interest in something. So yeah, like definitely, like there's certain courses that you can, that you can see, um, that there has been maybe that bit more childhood trauma.
It's interesting as well because I imagine a lot of them are wanting to give back, and given what they've gone through, to learn the skills and the knowledge to help others who have gone through the same thing, hence going to something like psychology and social work. So that speaks to me about like finding meaning in your own suffering and turning that into a way to help others with their suffering, which is, in a conversation which has been very deep and dark at times, is very hopeful, I think, to see in here. Who in college students is particularly at risk beyond those who have experienced childhood adversity? Are there other particular subgroups who you find are particularly at risk of mental illnesses, higher rates of psychological distress?
Yeah, so one group in particular, that when you ask me that question, the first thing that jumps out at me is, again, within our studies, students who identify as non-heterosexual, so be it gay, bisexual, pansexual, um, much, much greater risk of having a range of mental health problems. That has jumped out in all of our studies. Again, you would, as with like not just like within the student population, but like that's, within any of our studies. Again, females tend to have more mood disorders, anxiety disorders. Males traditionally tend to have more substance use disorders. Um, and another group that we've really found within our student population as having a wide range of mental health problems and being at much more risk would be neurodivergent students. So again, we're doing a lot of work with students living with ADHD. ADHD has become very much to the fore recently. Um, a lot of students are identifying, now they mightn't have a formal diagnosis of ADHD, but we did a study with people who were living with symptoms basically of ADHD. So again, very, very high risk group in terms of suicidal behaviour and a lot of coexisting mental health problems, alongside their symptoms of ADHD. And that group can really, really struggle within the university setting, but I suppose in any setting really. So again, we're trying to look at, different interventions that might help. We developed a mental health literacy and wellbeing program that has been proved to be really beneficial.
At either a global college student level or at the subgroup level, is it something special about the university environment which tends to make these mental health conditions, symptoms worse, or do you think this is more indicative of just young people in general who, you know, rates of mental health and mental illness in young people in general are quite dire? But do you think it's something special about the university environment as well, or what role does university itself, college itself, play?
I suppose it can depend on different colleges. I mean, some colleges have more support available than others. I think the issue with mental health among college students, um, so as I said to you, a lot of them are coming in with pre-existing problems, but then the college life can actually exacerbate it for other students. So it can be just that, living away from home for the first time, and financial pressures is becoming a huge issue. Um, Now I know within the UK and Ireland, well, UK is like the fees are really high in the UK, and like a lot of students, are coming out, with really high student loans, for example. Cost of living crisis here as well. Accommodation is a huge issue. It's so expensive, and the bigger cities, it can be really difficult to get accommodation now within Ireland. Like if you're in some of the bigger cities like Dublin, Galway, um, it can be so hard to get accommodation, and when you do, it is so expensive. And I think financial issues is a huge issue for the college students population. And as I said, COVID, the COVID pandemic has had a huge impact as well, because so many of the students that are coming into college now spent a few years online, and people that are coming towards the end of their college experiences, a lot of them spent the first year or two at college online, not in the college setting, not getting to know their peers and having that peer support relationship going on. A lot of them on particular courses, like say for example, weren't able to get their placement opportunities, get their lab work, that practical hands-on experience. So like there's lots of issues, and I think you're going to see that going forward for a while.
Yeah. What you're saying really, I think, is summed up as well by what I discussed with Dr. Chris Blackmore. He studies university mental health at University of Sheffield. And in a previous episode, we were discussing how university is about transitions. It's transitions from moving out of home or moving from home out of home for the first time. It's a different, more self-paced learning environment. Often people are having to juggle work and studies for the first time. There's a transition in terms of your social connections are all uprooted. So that culmination of transitions can be very difficult for people to handle if they haven't thought prior as to how they are going to handle that, which for many people they haven't.
Yeah. And I mean, like it is, it's a whole transition as well, as you said, like from secondary school education, and to and like they would say, like the research would say, like that A levels, within the UK system, is nearly like they're spoon fed, whereas they're out independently, having to go to classes. Mommy's not getting them up, out of bed in the morning. So then, like if you fall behind at all with your classes, that's just like causing even more stress. So it's this self-directed learning environment, where you're taking ownership, um, for, if you've assignments due in, and, there's just that added academic stress. And obviously, different courses, have different stressors. Like, people would often talk, about medical students, being under so much stress. But like, I think in general, like the majority of courses can be stressful. So it's just, keeping, keeping on top of it. And it's just, learning, how to, get a good time, your timetable, and as you say, trying to balance all these other stressors. And like a big thing as well within the college, setting now is this widening access. So, we were talking about widening access, to people that have come from, maybe poorer backgrounds, and there's different routes now into university. So you've a lot of mature students coming in that maybe couldn't go when they were younger, so they also have, they're balancing work, they're balancing maybe having a young family as well. So like there's just so many different stressors out there for students now.
Yeah, and it seems like widening access as well in terms of people coming from poorer backgrounds, lower socioeconomic areas where a lot of this childhood diversity does propagate, and so does mental health. Therefore, again, they're coming into university with these pre-existing kind of risk factors.
Yes, definitely. I mean, the widening access is like, it is absolutely brilliant to see, and it's great that like I came back to college myself as a mature student. I'd studied something else at an earlier age, and it's just such a different experience, for the mature student. And but I mean, I think just colleges need to be mindful as well that it's not just your traditional 18 or 19-year-old that's starting college, that's coming, from an affluent background. People are coming into college. They could be the first person in their family that has ever attended college. And again, for mature students, just maybe be mindful, that different supports might be required.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I as well studied for a while, deferred, went, did some things in the fitness industry, started my own gym, loved that, but then decided I wanted to come back, and I was 25 thereabouts when I came back. But my real struggle was that when I came back personally, it was actually as an 18-year-old going in and going into a self-guided environment where I needed to be spoon-fed. So if you look at my transcript from the first year, I've got about 6 or 7 fails because I just did not go to class, did not keep up with things. So, and this really, to me, in terms of transitions, I feel like a solution is to better prepare college students for all these transitions beforehand, to have these conversations, to set a real expectation. Because I think for a lot of students, the impression going into college is that it's going to be, this wonderful time of parties and opportunities, which it is, but there is also another side to that coin, which perhaps isn't talked about a lot when people go into university or college.
I'm glad you actually said that. I know I hadn't mentioned it to you beforehand, but I've just received a fellowship to conduct a study, and that's what we're going to be looking at as the transition to college. So within like our studies, obviously we're finding lots of people coming into college with mental health problems. So it's and everybody in the area is saying, look, more needs to be done at an earlier age. So it's like what can be done to aid that transition, um, and like what can be done further back, to prevent these mental health problems. I mean, like if college students, if people are coming in at 18 or 19 with these mental health problems, what's happening in those years beforehand? I mean, most mental health problems will kind of come about during, that kind of middle adolescence, like 15, 16 year olds. I mean, like if 8% of students are saying to me that they've attempted suicide prior to starting college. So something needs to be done at an earlier age in secondary school, in primary school, which is where we've talked about these resilience building programs. Like that's not just for people that experience childhood trauma. I think that's things need to be done overall. And in my work as well, and it's kind of going a bit off track, but like I talk about childhood trauma, childhood adversities, but I also talk about children that I think that are nearly, how would you say, at the other end of the scale, where they've been pampered by their parents,
Yeah.
and they've been overprotected. Like there's parents can be quite controlling and overindulgent. So these children have never had to deal with trauma. I mean, we talked earlier on in the podcast about, like some stress can be beneficial in that you learn to deal with negative things. Whereas if you've had everything handed to you all your life and you've never had to deal with trauma and never had, somebody say no to you, then, you can get like quite a big wake up call when something goes wrong. So somebody goes to college and they are, they fail an exam. They just can't cope because they've never had to cope with things like that. So that's another thing that I'm going to be studying. So I'll come back in 4 years' time and tell you all about my transition and transition to college and
Yeah.
as I say, what we find, what can be done.
That sounds exciting, and congratulations on the fellowship, Margaret. That sounds very exciting personally for you, and I'm sure for the field as well. And so I'm curious, are there other ideas that you have on transitions and helping that? Obviously, it sounds very early and you've just been awarded the fellowship, but I'm very curious, are there other ideas as to how you can go about helping that transitional period?
So I think, within the one of the first things like we're going to look at is like how schools could maybe help better prepare students for going into colleges, but also how, like what colleges themselves can do. As you say, like people are going in with like really like wrong expectations for college. I think they think, oh, it's just going to be another extension to school and the lecturer's just going to, hand me out my notes and give me photocopies of this and this. And unfortunately that's just not the case. Yeah. Yeah. So like that's some of the areas that we're going to be looking at. And basically as well, like how parents themselves can better prepare themselves. Like I know a lot of work has been done, like the college that I'm working in at the minute. Like they've parent evenings, and like like parents are encouraged to come with their kids to open days. And like I know, like even in comparison, to a few years ago, I think there's a lot more open days. And like I have children myself, like teenagers I've one in that has just started college, I have another one going to college next year, hopefully. But they, I think colleges are definitely doing a lot more, to help that transition. So, I mean, it's great to see, and it seems to be improving year on year. So it'll be good to see how that transpires.
Mm. Just on that note of expectations, is thinking back as you're talking about that as well. I know for me, it felt like, okay, I've got through year 12, which I think is like the A level equivalent of what you guys have in the UK. And great, you've done all the work now. You can just put your feet up and relax, and you can just coast through uni. So I think certainly hearing less of that message and more of the opposite would have helped me. But interesting to see if other people have that expectation when you do your work. So one of the really fascinating findings that was very surprising to me when I read it in your work was that 23% of college students who met the threshold for mental health problems in a particular study that you did actually stated that they don't want to seek treatment. Now, you alluded to this earlier, but can you expand on that? Because that was really enlightening and surprising. Why are they not wanting to seek treatment if they meet the threshold for these problems?
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier, like stigma, is still a big issue for them. When we dived into it a bit more, what we found is that some of the students were saying, particularly those on certain courses, they were afraid, say within the college setting, to look for help because they were afraid that that would actually impact on their future career. It could impact on their college, how the college would look at them. Now, I mean, if we're talking to students, like we're really emphasizing that isn't the case. If you contact student counselling services, like it's not that they're reporting to the dean of the college, oh, this person, has mental health problems. I mean, if which is why like we're really really trying to encourage people, if you have a problem, is to try and get that help early. um we asked numerous questions as to like why they hadn't looked for help. a lot of them were saying that they really wanted to deal with it on their own. Now, yes, sometimes like you can deal with problems on your own, but sometimes it can just take that, just talking to somebody else about it. Now, a lot of them did say that they would talk to family and friends about it. But in general, a lot of them were saying, no, 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 it's not that severe. I can deal with it myself. And you know, I think a lot of it was that they didn't really recognize that maybe that they did have a mental health problem.
That finding is really interesting to me about I can do it on my own. I don't need help. And I've been thinking about it because I did see this in your paper, and I think you even found that that was a higher percentile than stigma in terms of the reasons why people aren't seeking treatment. And from one point of view, I'm thinking that's great. Autonomy, power to you. If you feel like that's the case, then there are ways to deal with it without necessarily seeking treatment. And then on another case, I'm thinking that, well, that's there are huge problems in student samples in terms of mental health. This is an underlying issue we need to fix. How can we fix it? How can we get people to reach out to treatment more? Where do you sit on that? Do you feel like people not wanting to reach out for help and feeling like they can do it on their own is a problem in itself?
There's there's loads of options out there now. So if somebody is saying, that they want to deal with it by themselves, I think it's maybe just pointing them in the right direction, pointing them into the direction of different services and things that might be available to them. So, I mean, if they don't want to come out and say that, that they have a problem, they don't want to talk to somebody within the college setting or whatever, that's fine. Now, some colleagues uh, had approached me about some of my work previously. It wasn't within my own college. It was a presentation I was doing for dental lecturers, and made a suggestion to them. It was something that I've done a few times. Is if you're doing a lecture, just as standard format, maybe have your last slide. You don't have to say anything, but just on your slide as you finish your class, something like it's okay not to be okay, and a list of services that are available within the college, within the college setting or maybe in the local community. This could be like a helpline, a link to something like the Samaritans or something like that. So it's just there as a visual for somebody so that if they are, if they are struggling, might think, oh, maybe I'll look into that. And again, it's like, within our college and, I'm sure lots of colleges, they would have, it could be an email going out to students saying, look, there's such and such on, online, like different options, that it's not that they have to go into a counselling service, but as I was saying to you, like looking at different options that are maybe online. So if they want to do something for themselves, that's fine. But just steering them maybe in a direction of where they might find that support to help themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I like it because, we see when people are forced or mandated to go to treatment, whether it's, through court or something, in that nature, generally the treatment outcomes aren't great. It's better when people come to their own accord to go to treatment, to therapy. So having those options there, making it accessible and aware so that when they're ready, they can go. But also I think it relates to what you're saying there and what we said earlier about having like that stepped care model where you've got the one-on-one counseling services, but you've got the apps, you've got the helpline, so that depending on where they are in their journey, they can go to something that's tailored to them in terms of where they're at, in terms of reaching out for support.
I think within the college setting as well, like, there's great opportunities, like, for peer support, like different, like, I suppose it's encouraging them. It mightn't necessarily be like something that's mental health related, but like, like, I suppose we hadn't really touched on it earlier, but like loneliness is a huge factor within the college setting. You know, like as I say, somebody that's moved away from home. You've loads of international students as well that are very far away from home. Um, so it's like just trying to get that interaction going. I'm not saying a support group, but like some sort of group that, it could be through sporting activities, it could be through something else that just gets them to make that connection with their peers.
That's so true. And my own experience, I used to be a trainer at a gym in Canberra, which at a university called the Australian National University. And the reason I mentioned that is that it attracted a lot of international students, but because Canberra is quite a small city, a lot of domestic students, but from places around Australia as well. And from what I just saw at the gym, so many people were there attending classes, working out in the gym, not necessarily for their physical health, but if just talking to the students, a huge percentage of their motivation was because this is where they get to see other people. For many of the international students in the group classes I taught, it was the only connection they had, particularly if you were like a PhD student just working in a lab, not in like a big class setting. And that sense of connection was so meaningful, so important to them.
When I went back to college as a mature student, I remember thinking, what am I doing here? You know, like among all these like younger students. And so like it's not just your international students. Like I think everybody comes with a different, different issues, that could potentially impact on their college experience. And that, if you're not having a good college experience, that can really impact on your mental health, unfortunately.
No, very true, very profound. Margaret, this has been a fantastic conversation. We've covered, so many different areas, and I'm really grateful to your time, your wisdom, your work, because it is really meaningful and impactful, certainly in my journey reading through this, and I'm sure for many listening in today. Is there anything that you'd want to share finally with listeners or with students tuning in today?
Not really as such, but like, other than just to say, look, if you are struggling, if there's a friend, if there's a colleague, a friend, somebody else that you're worried about, just, just ask them, are they okay? And if they say, yeah, I'm grand, in Ireland, everybody says, yeah, we're grand. Just say, look, are you really okay? Like, don't be afraid to ask people, um, you know, I think just be there for each other. It's just so important.
You never know, right? That one conversation could change someone's life or save someone's life, depending on where they're at.